everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to the first bonus full skein yarn dyeing video of the 2023 ChemKnits Chanukah special. So I think that makes tonight night 9 of Chanukah. Last night I used my blooming lilac trees as inspiration for the palette, but the final speckled colorway I wouldn't necessarily call lilac blossom. So I wanted to revisit my lilac tree inspiration for tonight's colorway, but use a technique similar to what I did to evoke cherry blossoms on a silk blend yarn. My goal is to create a soft speckled colorway with a base that has white and bits of soft lilac purple on it. And then I want to have some light speckles in that same purple and probably brown on top of it. I adored the pink version of this colorway, and so I think I'm gonna equally love a purple version. Tonight we are going to be dyeing Wool to Dye For's Diamond Sock Yarn. This yarn is 80% superwash merino wool, 20% silk. It is a 2-ply yarn with a lot of twist. It is soft, has stunning drape, a beautiful sheen, and I've really enjoyed dyeing it in part of my spring and summer mini skein mini series. But I don't think I've ever dyed full skeins of it, full 100-gram skeins of it before. I prepared the yarn for dyeing by adding on some removable nylon zip ties onto the yarn. This means that I can grab it easily, and it helps me prevent tangling the yarn throughout the entire process. Plus, this gives us an extra tie before pre-soaking. With silk blends, and even though this is a superwash blend, I tend to like to pre-soak the yarn for longer. Since I'm doing a colorway today that will have some of the white left behind, overnight isn't as necessary as if I was trying to dye this a more saturated tonal and wanted to make sure to avoid obvious white patches from areas that were dry. Overall though, from dyeing this yarn in mini skeins over a couple different spring mini skein mini series, I have found that it does absorb water pretty well, but for this I am going to pre-soak the yarn overnight. Right now I'm just showing this in a small basin, but I'm also going to put a lot of other skeins into my 5-gallon bucket. Again, right now with just plain tap water. We will add acid as needed as we are about to start prototyping. That gives us more control if I decide I want more or less acid later on. I was debating between two different purples for this colorway, Electric Violet and Royal Purple. And from past swatches I'd done, I knew that they were relatively similar, even though Royal Purple is definitely more pigmented. But I just didn't know if I had the dyes dilute, how they might feel compared to one another. And I was afraid that the Electric Violet might feel too pink. So I took a tiny amount of dye of each of the colors while wearing my respirator mask and safety glasses, and then dissolved it in hot tap water and on a yarn mop, added little bits of the dye on to see how I would feel about the color. And the results are super similar. This side is our Electric Violet, this side is our Royal Purple. You know, I think that the Electric Violet pastel is a hair more blue. The Royal Purple is a hair more pink. Ultimately, the colors are super similar, which honestly makes things easier and harder. But I think that this means I'm going to go with my original idea and plan, and that is to use Electric Violet for this colorway. But also, this is just a reminder that sometimes when you have a color that you want to do and you want to play with, and you want to use it as a pastel, it's worth checking the tone and seeing if it'll bring you where you want to be before you go ahead and start and then realize, oh, this green looks way too yellow pastel, and things like that. Now, as for all this leftover dye, I'm going to set it aside because I want to make a dye stock of our Electric Violet. That way I can measure a bit more and have some amount of consistency from batch to batch. Oh, and this yarn mop is Knit Picks Felici, 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon, and I pre-soaked it in just some water with a couple splashes of white vinegar. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, and measured out 2.5 grams of the electric violet dye, and then dissolved it in hot tap water for a total volume of 250 milliliters. This is going to give us a 1% stock solution, and even though we're going to use such tiny amounts of it as we go and to make our pastel on the yarn, I will know, okay, if I have a cup full of water, maybe I want to add 5 milliliters or 10 milliliters of this dye. This will allow me to make approximately the same pastel concentration over and over again. Of course, I might want to make a few different depths of our pastel color, because I'll need to keep in mind that whatever color I see wet on a silk blend will be a lot more pastel once it's dry compared to a non-silk superwash yarn. I also needed to prepare the dye for our speckles. And so I took 2 tablespoons of a kitchen grade finely milled citric acid powder, and then a 1/2 teaspoon of dye of either the Pecan Brown or Electric Violet and mix it together. And then I tested the concentration of the dye with the citric acid powder on the yarn mop, because I knew if I was seeing speckles too close together, I could add more citric acid powder. If I wasn't seeing enough speckles, then I could add more dye. All right, here is our yarn mop. We've got our Pecan Brown speckles. They may be a little close, but I did speckle a little heavy, so if I need to, I can dilute the dye further. But the Electric Violet is also just looking good. I think I'm just gonna have to, when I speckle with my fingers, really spread things out. But I should have more than enough dye to do the couple dozen skeins of this colorway that I need to do. But I'm also going to bring over another yarn mop so that way I have that to clean off the spoons. Should probably have put my gloves back on. I'll have this, so I'll go rinse that. Yeah, and so now we have 2 yarn mops. We can steam set them in the middle as needed. This one is Knit Picks Swish DK. And I am going to wipe down the counter really well before we start speckling, but oh, I just remembered why I wanted another yarn mop. Okay, we'll bring that back over. Because today is a case where the volume of dye that we have matters. So I'm going to grab about 10 milliliters of our 1% stock solution, and I'm adding it to about 1 cup of water. But just to show you, I'm going to add just a drop of that 1% stock solution on. Well, I guess I did it in 2 places. Let's do a few more, just so you can see that on its own, this color is very pigmented, and that's much brighter and deeper than what I want. So I'm not going to bring over my foam brush and see. Okay, I think that is pretty, but it is also more pigmented than I would like. So I'm going to want to dilute it more. Okay, and now we have 2 cups of water in here. Now we have about 10 milliliters in 3 cups of water. Stir that up with the other brush. Bring it over, and that is looking nice and pastel. And depending on how little, or I guess if I do more, that gives us less and more of the color. I might want to do some that are even lighter than that. So why don't I also squeeze out this first brush. Okay, let's also try, well, that's 2 milliliters. We're gonna try 1 milliliter in 1 cup of water and see how this feels. Is this gonna give us a barely there kind of color? Yes. Okay, so this is barely there. Let's do 1 more milliliter approximately. Okay, this gives us something super pastel. They are close. They are not quite the same. Let me see if I can rotate this so we can have some bare yarn. Okay, we have 10 milliliters in 3 cups of water. Then we have about 2 milliliters in 1 cup of water. And so both of these are pastel. One is slightly more pastel than the other, and so this will just give us a little bit more depth using these 2 concentrations on our yarn. And this one, when dry, might look barely there. This one has a little more pigment, so we should still be able to see it in the end. Before we get started applying the dye, I want to add some acid to this pre-soak. And I decided I'm going to kind of measure my 1, 2 splashes of vinegar. It's about 3/4 of this cup full. So that's multiple tablespoons of white vinegar, but I'm actually going to make a little mark. I'm going to make a mark here and write 2 glugs. So then I have that, just in case I need to make another batch, because with the water in here, once I remove the yarn, I can add more yarn from our pre-soaks into here and they'll get acid, but I might need to make another bath at some point. But even after this just quick little soak in here, our yarn is ready to go. So let's start dyeing. Okay, I am over here with 200 grams of yarn. I am going to spread it out just on the counter. And we're gonna start using those foam brushes to give us our quote petals. I'm gonna start with the lightest one. Now, eventually, I will probably do multiple rounds of speckles, multiple rounds of this with the paint brushes, and then do speckles later on, and so I'll probably do 2 rounds of this before we start doing the dry dye powder, just because that way there'll be less cleanup and transition that needs to happen in between. And so I'm just dotting, but you can tap in more, you can try to spread it through, but the pressure of bringing the foam brush in does give us some good color penetration. And you can see if I dip the brush in multiple times, it's possible we could get some color breaking and some hue differences. But now this other one is just a little darker. If I come in with a little more liquid, then maybe that is going to have a hair more pigment. But we're randomly applying the purple, so there's differences. And here you can see I have a little puddle. I can bring a yarn mop over to mop it up. It's okay if we have a little bit of color there, but we're just trying to get some coverage and leave some white in. But I didn't, when I was doing the yarn mops, I didn't squeeze out a lot of the water, so there's a lot more liquid in there than there is in here. But now I'm gonna flip. And the goal when we flip is to expose large white patches. And you can see that this isn't taking very long at all. That's the beauty of something that is so random and organic. I will say that even on just these 2, I'm using up a lot of this more pastel color that I have. And there's no reason why I can't do a line like all the way across, but I'm enjoying just sort of the random application. But so yes, I will probably need to replenish, especially that lightest purple, fairly frequently, but we will, of course, see. And again, white left behind is totally fine. And so then I'm gonna pick up the skein and look specifically for areas where I want a little more color. Just sort of inspecting, because there might be a long stretch at some point or other that was tucked beneath everything else. Also, I guess you can check around the zip tie, but some white left is totally fine, and not just fine, but expected. Let's see. And I know I'm dripping, but I'm just trying to break up large patches of white. Of course, we will be able to do this with the speckles eventually as well. but the goal is for the purples to sort of go in and out and feel like a very subtle backdrop. And the goal is also for it to almost feel like the speckles have spread in some areas, even though we're doing this manually. So I'm gonna set these aside by just picking them up, sticking them here in this container. It's okay if we have color transfer from one section to another. I'm not gonna heat set it before we do speckles. I'm gonna go squeeze out some liquid from our yarn mops, just so that way I can quickly wipe up some drips. But then I'm gonna bring over 2 more skeins and just quickly apply this purple color on them like I did before. Okay, I think that the way I had it laid out, where without both sides on top of each other, it helped to get more coverage. And one reason why I sort of scrunch the yarn up like this is not just to get access to more layers of the yarn versus just the smaller surface area, but it's so that way things aren't going to be super regular repeating, because I think they do this with hair sometimes too. If things are teased and you make a line here, when you open it up, the line is going to be softer, and so that'll help, I guess, prevent pooling. But I think we're ready to do some speckling now. One of the most important things here is that my gloves are dry as we're gonna do this. Now, the Electric Violet did have some clumps. In that old time lapse, I tried to break them up as much as I could, but obviously I wasn't able to do all of it. And I want the speckles all over, but it's also okay for there to be areas without speckles. But I'm pinching up the dye powder like I would salt if I wanted to sprinkle salt on something, and you don't want like a ton, you just want a little bit of that fleck of flavor. Now, we did remove a lot of liquid from here, but we also added liquid back in when we went in with those paintbrushes. And so we should have enough liquid around to help this color absorb. And I'm coming in, I sort of like went heavier in sections, but I'm coming in very lightly in some more, quote, gap areas. Just again, so it is random. I don't want it to feel like the speckles are oscillating or anything like that. Okay, and I wiped my fingers on my yarn mop, and I'm gonna get the brown. I'll zoom in once I'm done with both colors. I probably should have started with the brown just because that takes a little longer to sink in and is a little harder to see almost. And so it's just a little harder as I'm going. I can't, because you can see when I mix it with the powder, things got lighter. I therefore can't really tell as easily where the brown is. But I'm trying to layer this brown in similar spots to where I have the violet. And it's okay if it goes in some areas where I didn't, but I don't exactly want things to feel like, ooh, we've got brown speckles and then purple speckles and they alternate. I want it to feel like these speckles are just all over. Now, it might seem a little counterintuitive, but if you want things to spread out more, sometimes raising your hand higher can help you spread things out, especially if you move as I gently move my fingers together. But that also does add some, not a lot, risk of missing your protected work surface, like what I have here. But, oh my gosh, this elevates this kind of colorway so much. Let me zoom you in. These little bit of speckles around, like you feel like you added the speckles and then some of it spread and gave you this halo. And something about that feels so floral. But you still get that feeling even when some of those areas miss and you hit the white. Because, I mean, there are times when you could have white flowers. Maybe not on like a lilac tree, but it's soft and subtle, and this colorway is bringing me so much joy. I do want to give this a little bit of time to let the dye soak in before I flip it. So I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. And if I was going to go straight from here into the steamer basket, I might not wait that long. But I know some of this dye will start to strike where I've placed it. And so if I move it too soon, I risk really spreading out those speckles versus letting them sort of exist where they are. So we're going to just give it a little bit of time, and then we'll flip the yarn and apply more powder. Now I'm going to flip the yarn over. I can definitely feel the moisture in here because from that like purple color that we added. If you're ever doing something like this and you feel like there's too much moisture in your yarn, like you feel it dripping or something as you go to do your speckles, you can steam set and then remove some of that liquid before you continue. So when we're flipping, my goal is to expose as much unspeckled area as possible. And then this time starting, whoop, that might have been a little heavy with some of this Pecan Brown, I'm going to apply the speckles. It really only took a moment or so for some of the speckles to sort of sink in. But with the Electric Violet, I can see the powder on the yarn a little bit more as I get started applying it. I feel like I went a little heavier on this side overall. It definitely helps like with the Electric Violet because I can see it as it's falling, and so then I know, oh, okay, that's enough. It's a little bit harder with the Pecan Brown. But once again, I'm going to wait 5 minutes, and then I'm just going to check through the yarn to see if I want to add any more color. Sometimes when you're speckling yarn, you might realize that, oh, there's some large areas that I missed as I was applying speckles. Now, often the speckles will only be on one side of the strand versus going through, so it can sometimes feel like there's areas without a lot. So on these extra flips, I'm really just checking for large looking areas of white. But it's okay if there's some, I just don't want there to be like one huge section that didn't get any speckles at all. And while I flip and move, there is some dye on the counter. We might get some of these colors that are less sharp, some of these speckles that spread a little bit more because of the movement or soaking them up from the counter. And that's okay. That's just part of the whole process. I think the coverage looked really good. I just added a tiny bit more because I could, but I'm not going to carefully pick up these skeins. I did not wait 5 minutes. Ooh, I do see a big patch of purple on one, on two. That happened. It is what it is, and I'm popping this into a steamer basket now. Now, eventually, I'm going to set a timer for 30 minutes, but I think I can fit 4 skeins in the steamer basket at one time. But right now, I want to clean up this counter a little bit with the yarn mop. And this is how I will be using our mops throughout the experience today to help clean up some of that dye from the countertop. And every once in a while, I will go ahead and pop these in a steamer basket for a little bit. But let's go speckle the next batch. I think I already mentioned, but the main reason why I'm waiting to start the timer is because I'll set a timer for 30 minutes once this yarn is also in the steamer basket. Even though probably 10 minutes or so will have passed, it's not going to hurt the other yarn to have a little bit more exposure to that heat. But otherwise, I would, if I had already set the timer, then I would just have to reset it when I added this other yarn. And so this is going to allow me to dye the yarn in sort of 4 skein batches when it comes to the speckling. I'm not sure if those deeper purple patches I saw as we were walking over were a result of a larger clump of purple dye or a little bit of purple dye landing on the counter, getting wet, spreading out, and giving us a more saturated punch to the yarn. But either way, it's there. Likely it would be one larger stitch speck on the overall canvas of our yarn. So not something I am that worried about, but oh my goodness, does this colorway have me excited. And now that I have finished the second batch, let's go over to the steamer basket. In our steamer basket, we have 400 grams of yarn, steam setting for 30 minutes. And while this is steam setting, I'm gonna start prepping more of the pastel purple. First, I did go ahead and rinse off the countertops, so that way there wasn't gonna be any residual speckles here. And then 2 skeins at a time, I dabbed on our 2 different levels of purple dye, setting the yarn aside in between each batch. I did soak the yarn in the vinegary solution that we had in the white tub before bringing it over to the countertop. You'll probably notice that I did more than 4 skeins here, but since this step is faster than the speckling step, I figured I would take care of as many rounds as I could. Since I had written down the concentration of our dyes as we lost our pastel purple mixes, because I used it up, not really losing it, as I used it up, I could go ahead and mix more. I definitely made way too much of our dye stock. I think I'm dyeing 30 skeins in this colorway total, but ultimately, I don't think that it's really gonna hurt to have leftover purple. Who knows, maybe we'll over dye our yarn mops depending how much color's on them. We will see where we are towards the end of the video. Okay, during that 30 minutes where we are very, very steamy right now, I was able to do the purple of about 8 skeins. Probably could have done some more, but oh my gosh, this is so pretty. Once we're a little less steamy, I'll zoom you in, but oh my goodness, I am in love. And it occurred to me, so see, there's, maybe I lost it. There's one of the larger patches of purple, sort of right there. Oh, and here are some. It's probably just because I speckled slightly heavier on that spot. So hopefully it won't detract too much from our colorway. Ooh, we've got a fair amount of liquid in here. Probably because this one was on the bottom. But I'm gonna let this cool so we can wash it. And as I mentioned, I'm gonna pop the yarn mops I've been using here in the steamer basket for a brief spell, maybe 5-10 minutes or so, just to help set or start to set that little bit of color. It's sometimes in the middle of doing this with a mop, it helps make the mop more efficient. I probably don't need 3 mops, but we'll see how much color is on them on the end and what else we want to do. But now I have to carry on with this colorway. I figured I'd show off one more round of speckling. Even though I feel like when I do countertop speckles like this, when I'm dyeing more fine speckles, when you're zoomed out, it's harder to see it on camera. But the speckles that we are getting here are super subtle. That purple that we have in the back is pastel. I think it's gonna melt into the rest of the yarn once it's dry. And I am just in love. Like, I love the combination of the white and pastel sort of splotches with then the speckles on top. I think it just adds a little bit more dimension to a very subtle type of colorway. And it makes me really, really happy. I knew as soon as I did this with pink that I really wanted to do it with purple too. And so I'm happy I did it. We're gonna wash the yarn in a second, but let's just take a closer look. These little speckles are so subtle, and yes, they are heavier in some places, but because of the way the yarn moves after picking it up, and it just sort of helped distribute them even further. I'm in love, and I've said that like 10 times already. But anyway, let's wash the yarn. Now, the only real concern I have when it comes to washing the yarn today is that we have some undissolved dye powder somewhere on these skeins, which isn't super likely, but when you're doing a technique on the countertop, it's possible for something to have not dissolved. And so then when we immerse it for the washing, it might then dissolve, and then that would be the bleeding that we'd be more expected. But I'm really otherwise not expecting any bleeding. And I'm gonna take a little bit of dish soap, add that to our water. Whew. Ooh, we see a brighter patch there. But the thing is, like, little patches like that will show up as like a little fleck on whatever you make with this yarn, which is so soft. Did I say a rogue red speckle? Ooh, I do, some pink. There must be some pink in with the electric violet, and so we see some breaking. Because I don't think pecan brown breaks, but the purples aren't primaries, so that could be. But I am not seeing any bleeding whatsoever, which makes me happy because we also still have white in our yarn, which of course was desired. And that's why we did a countertop technique, because you can get some spread around the speckles like this if you're doing an immersion technique, but you can't really control as easily having the white interspersed in there. So I love it. I love when I decide white is part of my palette. See there's a few more counts. But anyway, I'm gonna finish rinsing out the soap. Then I will take all this yarn, put it through my spin dryer, and hang it up to dry. It's time to leave no dye behind, and I'm bringing over one of our pre-soaks that have those splashes of acid. Okay, and this is cold for now, but I'm gonna come over with some leftover dyes. This has the two purples we had at the very beginning. Here I have a little bit of the purples that was left from my sponging. We have a lot of our dye stock left, but I'm gonna take just 20 milliliters of the dye stock, add it, and I'm gonna rinse off what's in this container. A little extra dye never hurt. And believe it or not, I still have almost, I mean it's a bit under 200 milliliters, but I've got almost 200 milliliters left, which is pretty incredible. Now, with our 3 yarn mops, there is acid in here already, but I'm just bringing them over, adding them into our cool dye bath, and we're gonna heat set this. And so some of the purples that are on here already will remain. Some things may spread out, but it's all good and beautiful. So I'm gonna heat this for 30 minutes and then we'll wash it off camera. But I'll show it off to you when we look at our finished dry yarn. It's gonna be very pretty. Here we have multiple skeins of our finished dry yarn. And the final colorway is very subtle and very pastel. The speckles are super soft. I'm gonna zoom in for a closer look in the moment, but things look super subtle, way more subtle than things did when they were wet because of the silk content in our yarn. Silk tends to be a little bit more translucent when it is wet, and so the difference in color between wet yarn with silk and dry yarn with silk versus wet yarn with just wool and dry yarn with just wool, the difference with the silk there is greater. And so it can be harder to predict what you're gonna end up with, but this is what I wanted. Anyway, let's zoom in. Our lavender that we painted on, those patches are super, super subtle, which in some areas they're so soft they just barely blend into the white. And I am so happy because that is what I wanted. I wanted the background to be a pastel, but I was afraid that going for a barely there purple would disappear completely, but that absolutely did not happen here today. The brown speckles are very, very subtle. I think partially because pecan brown is such a cool toned brown that it almost leans gray. And so looking at this, you feel the purple, but I think if I didn't have those brown speckles present, you wouldn't feel as much dimension. It might feel a little bit more one note. But certainly there are areas and skeins in here where I went a lot heavier with the speckles, and then some where I was a little bit more light-handed. And so there's a lot of variation from batch to batch because all of this dyeing was done by feel. Even though I did measure our concentrations of the purple, but the amount of purple I added to each skein varied. And so I feel like that backdrop is going to be very similar. It's the total amount of speckles that might vary a little bit. I feel like here you can feel a skein that's heavier. Here is one that's lighter, or at least that's a section where the speckles are lighter. There's still definitely speckles in this skein. It's just, those were very likely different batches. Electric violet is not a primary pigment. And by primary pigment, I'm not meaning, I mean, obviously a purple is a secondary color, but what I mean is that it is a blend of different acid dye pigments. And so occasionally we see breaking, like here. And so here we see a vibrant, more magenta section. This is a big example of some breaking. Mostly you might see like a tiny little pink dot surrounded by other colors. And this can happen because when the dyes are milled and blended together, there could be some specks that are mostly one pigment versus another. And so you see a lot of breaking with speckles in colors that tend to have, I guess, a lot of different pigments, or I would say multiple pigments that are at similar proportions. You might be more likely to see breaking. Or otherwise, when you have pigments that bind to the yarn at different rates, then sometimes there you can see breaking as well. So like a color like Purple Pop, where it breaks if you just glance at it. With speckling, you would have a more blue speckle surrounded by a pink, just because those pigments strike at different rates. And so this pink and whatever else is in there to give us this purple aren't necessarily binding at different rates, but you might see some rogue pink specks. I didn't dye up any of this particular colorway on a non-silk blend yarn this time. I've been dyeing full skeins of a lot of colorways for Chanukah so far, but if you're curious about how this diamond sock dyes compared to platinum sock even, in the spring or summer mini skein mini series, certainly from 2023 and 2022, I used diamond sock in a lot of the videos. And so you can go look there and get a sense of how it might appear differently. The yarn mops are more pigmented than our base color. Like looking at them, it almost looks like, at least from the tiny monitor, that the base color is just white, which it's not. But not only did we have more, I mean, we just had a lot more dye on them. So it's not even like a superwash merino without silk versus one with silk comparison here. It's just legitimately, there was a lot more dye that went onto these three skeins. But ultimately, I'm very happy that I did decide to over dye these in purple. And it sort of tied in some of those purple and more brown splotches, and I think it makes them all really, really pretty. Looking at the twisted skeins, again, we can see some with a lot more speckles, one that looks like it has less. But when I twist, it still does have a fair amount of speckles there. The other thing I like with this colorway about twisting it up is that it makes it a little easier to see the contrast between the white and the lavender, because it's so subtle that when laid flat, it sort of blends together a little bit more, and I think is a little, it's not that it's hard to see on camera, but when the yarn is twisted, yes, you still have some areas that blend, but you also have areas where you can see sort of the lavender right next to the white, and so you can feel those splotches more. But I love how this just evokes like a shower of petals to me. And if I really wanted to do a colorway for like my lilac trees, I would need to bring in a lot more green. There would need to be a lot of green in there as well. Actually, imagine doing this colorway, but also having some green splotches that you paint on. And it could be a little more pigmented using a smaller brush. That could be fun. That could be fun because you don't usually have your lilacs blooming while there's still snow on the ground, but somehow this is what I'm feeling here in this colorway today. There's definitely a randomness to this colorway, and you could, when knitting with it, have, if you say if you're going to make two socks, it's not necessarily asymmetric, but you could have one sock with more speckles than the other. And so that is something that could happen. But similarly, if you're going to make knee-high socks with two skeins, they might also feel different because of just the randomness and the differing amounts of dye that I added on each of them. In this kind of scenario, what I like to say is to, if you're using multiple skeins, alternate skeins every couple of rounds. That way it won't be dramatic like, ooh, here is where I changed skeins. But with this kind of colorway, I don't think it would be super dramatic because it is overall so subtle. But ooh, look at how it contrasts with the yarn mops at the top. Imagine even just having like a deeper tonal purple and blending that with this speckly colorway. Not to mention that this yarn is incredibly soft. It has great drape. You can see drape even in the skein that I am holding. It is so, so soft. And I just want to play with it a lot myself. So what do you think of this colorway and this technique? I love a really good, subtle, speckled colorway, and those pastel splotches of color, mwah, make it perfect. I would love to try this technique on, say, a superwash wool nylon blend. I'm a little unsure if I'd be able to get the pastel patches to feel pastel enough, but I definitely want to try. I feel like in the case of the diamond sock yarn base, the silk content in there really helped me out, because since that helps make colors feel a little bit lighter in the end, it helped me make sure that we really got just like a whisper of that purple lavender color on the yarn. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and please make sure you are subscribed to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. There are still 2 more videos in the 2023 ChemKnits Chanukah special. Tomorrow night, we are going to be dyeing 100-gram skeins of a Sparkle DK colorway, which I'm super excited to show you. And then the next night, we're going to have a vlog and look at behind the scenes of me creating the whole series for this year. Don't forget to go check out the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop for hand-dyed yarn featured in my videos. I might even have a couple skeins of yarn in the colorway from tonight left. Maybe not, they may have sold out, but it's worth checking in the Chanukah section. Of course, you can also get a Chanukah sampler. There might be a few more of those left as well. I guess since Chanukah technically ended last night, I mean, I could still say Happy Chanukah, but that doesn't quite work the same anymore. But what I can do is thank you so much for watching. Bye!